this. It's been really funny because everybody keeps coming up to me and saying, "Happy first Father's Day." And what's interesting is actually last year, today, on this day, I found out that we were expecting our son, Oliver. And so this is actually my second Father's Day because I knew on Father's Day that we were having Oliver. And there was one person outside of Andrea, or two people outside of Andrea and I who knew. And it was funny because it was Sean and Chrissy. We told them when we went out to dinner with them the night I found out because I couldn't contain it. I was so excited. I felt like I was going to burst. And then in the lobby on Sunday when we came in here, Sean walked up to me and looked around to make sure nobody was in earshot. And he whispers, he goes, "Happy Father's Day." And it was amazing. And so I just was cracking up at that, remembering that this morning. And he's over there. Yeah, hey, buddy. But man, today I wanted to start just by saying thank you to all of you who have shared your testimony with us these past few weeks. I know the impact that they've each, amen, yeah. I know all the testimonies have made an impact on my life, and what's been so cool is just how, in fact, God is still very much at work each and every day, amen? Like, even in this very moment, God is still moving, God is still working, and I'm thankful for that. And so today, you actually get to hear my story. You get to hear my testimony about the way God has worked in my life. And there's going to be moments where it looks like, man, was God really working then? Or was he absent? Those are questions that I've had to wrestle with in my life. And see, when I sing a song about "It Is Well," I realize that even in those moments, God was still good, and it is well with my soul. And so today you get to hear from me my story about how God works in broken places. You get to hear about a God who doesn't just love me, but a God who loves you too. And how our life is meant to reflect Jesus, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And I know you've probably heard a little bits and pieces each time I've spoken about my story, but today I want you to have a full picture. And so that's where we're going to start. And my life started being born into a family who was very much involved with their church. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. My mom and dad decided to have 4 kids in just under 6 years. So we're all very close in age. And all of us were at the church at the same time. And we were there 4 times a week. And my parents were not in ministry. It was like we were pastors' kids without being pastors' kids. And it involved my parents sang on worship teams, and they volunteered in kids ministry. They actually led a kids choir, which I was part of, and you're going to be thankful that I'm no longer on stage singing because it's not pretty. They were involved in a life group, and then we had normal Sunday services. I grew up at a church. I knew the hallways, I knew the hiding places, I knew where to get into trouble and how to stay away from it. I knew a code to get into the pastor's office so I could go and mess with things and then later get in trouble for it. Life was good. And what's crazy is if we weren't at the church, all the pastor's kids were hanging out at our house because my mom babysat them throughout the week. And so I grew up around the idea of church. I grew up knowing who God was. Life revolved around church, but our activity didn't mean that our lives were transformed by any means. Really, it just meant we stayed busy. Honestly, things from the outside looked really good, but on the inside, we were very broken. My family had a long battle with financial struggles, and all this came to a head when we would continue to hear our parents arguing what felt like the 1,000th time over money and money and money, and it was frequent. And I don't even know if my parents paid attention to the fact that we could hear, because at that point, it was all that it was about. Now, we were loved, and thankfully, we didn't experience any abuse. I played sports growing up, and my parents were there at my games to watch me and be supportive. But then there came a time where money ran out, and we could no longer play sports that we loved. We couldn't afford the new cleats. We couldn't afford a new baseball glove. I loved playing catcher, and all the other kids had their own catching equipment, and I couldn't afford it. And then I remember it was in the 4th grade. I came home from school one day, and there were these men in my house who I didn't know. And they were grabbing all of my clothes. They were grabbing all of our items as a family and throwing them out onto a lawn, on our front lawn. To make matters worse, I lived in Michigan, so it was snowing about 90% of the time. And on that day, it was snowing. So all of our stuff got wet and damaged. Our furniture, all of our mattresses, dressers, clothes, whatever it was, all my toys were scattered on my front lawn. And this was the very first time I realized my life is not normal. I lived differently than the way my friends did. They didn't have to worry about where they were going to call home that night, and all of a sudden I had to. Their parents drove nice cars. They had these huge houses with pools in the backyard, while I had a trash bag for a dresser. After a month, we lived with my grandparents, and from there we moved into another house. And thankfully, we had some assistance getting into this house that we were renting, and it only took 3 months for this to happen again. So then we were out, all on our own, trying to figure out where we were going to go. It was in the middle of my 5th grade year when my family went and we moved into a hotel. And the hotel was paid for by our church. They knew our struggle. And there were 6 of us living in one small hotel room with 2 beds. So that meant that I slept on a makeshift bed made out of the couch cushions, right next to the heating and air conditioning vent. I remember the noise of this thing. It still haunts me to this day when I go to a hotel room and I can hear the air conditioner. Life was tough. And I didn't tell anybody about my home life. Those at church, they maybe knew, but I didn't share. Those in school, they had no idea that this is what home looked like. I kept everything private. I had a lot of friends, but I couldn't invite a friend over to my house because it didn't exist. I didn't let anyone in, and I shut everybody out. I didn't have any behavioral issues at school. In fact, I actually did really well in school because that was the only thing I felt like I could control. I was one of the students that was doing math a couple grades ahead of where I was at, because I threw myself into it. School wasn't the issue, but when I got home, everything changed. It was like I was a completely different person. And living in a hotel gets really old really fast. When there's so many people in such a small space, things get really tense. Eventually, our time ran out that we could stay at the hotel. And I remember a conversation between my parents, with my mom telling my dad that, hey, we got to figure this out. She said, and if we can't, then I'm going to take the kids. I'm going to go live with my sister in this tiny 2-bedroom house that my aunt owned at the time. And after that conversation, that was the last time I ever heard my dad's voice for a long time. I woke up the next morning and he was gone. All of his stuff. I don't remember him ever saying goodbye. I don't remember him ever giving me any sort of explanation. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't. And this feeling of abandonment would stay with me for a very long time. I didn't realize how much this hurt me. In fact, most of the things I'm sharing today, I didn't realize how much of an impact they've played in my life. I tended to hide things, tended to push things away because I didn't want to address it. But as a staff, we're reading this book, which has walked us through our emotional health, and it talks about going back to your past, and I'm still walking through that, going back to my past and recognizing how it plays into my future. See, the thing is, I used to put on the happy face and pretend like everything was fine, and I'm just going to keep moving forward and keep moving forward. But the reality is things were not fine, and I was very, very broken. So now the 5 of us moved into my aunt's house, and we were living in this tiny little 2-bedroom house, and by tiny, I mean it was around 900 square feet. We had to get really creative with the sleeping arrangements, and most of our mattresses got destroyed, and so that's where I learned all about air mattresses. Still to this day, I can't stand sleeping on an air mattress because I was the youngest kid, and so that meant that I got the one that would leak the air, and by the end of the night, I was on the floor. It felt like forever since our family had heard from our dad. It was maybe 6 months, but in that time, we had no idea where he was. Did he leave the state? Was he with my grandparents living there? What was going on in his life? Is he working? Is he not? Where was he? We honestly had no idea. And then one day, out of the blue, we got a phone call from a phone number we had no idea who it was. And I grew up, I didn't have a cell phone, so I actually had to memorize some phone numbers. Now today, you can just look it up and it does all the work for you. But I knew most of the phone numbers that would call our house. This one, I had no idea who it was. And I remember my brother answered, and he was shocked that it was my dad. And my dad asked to meet us at a park nearby so that we could see him and talk about maybe having visitation times. This was a park that I knew very, very well because it's the park that I grew up playing baseball at. It's where I learned a game that I deeply, deeply love still to this day. Actually, my debit card, I'm not going to show you because then it's going to be all on the internet, but my debit card has a baseball on it still to this day because it's a game that I love. So we met at the park, and the first time seeing him was so weird. Felt like it was a face that I knew, but I had no idea really who he was anymore. All of a sudden, all these emotions came into me, and I was angry, I was confused, I was lost, I was hurt, and then I had all of these questions, but there was one question that I just wanted to know. Why? Why would you do this to us? Why would you leave without saying goodbye? Why would you leave without even giving me a tiny explanation? How could you leave a family that you said you loved? Why does one do this to his family? My dad told us that he still loved us and he wanted to continue to see us. But he also told us one thing, and it was the reason why he left. I finally got my answer. But it was an answer I wasn't looking for. My dad, he shared with me for a long time that he felt like he was living a lie in his life. His whole entire life was a lie. See, it was in this meeting that my dad told me he got married and he had kids because he wanted to make his grandparents and his parents happy. But the reality was, he shared that he knew from the moment he was born that he was gay. For anyone, this revelation can have abundance of feelings. For me, it hurt to know that I was part of this lie that he was living. It felt like that I wasn't even wanted, that I didn't matter to him. I was sad, but more than anything, I was angry. And yeah, I was angry with my dad, but the truth is I was furious with God. See, I grew up going to a church and I would hear all about a God who loved me, but yet my truth, my life didn't reflect that God loved me. I grew up saying, God, where are you? Why does this happen to people who go to church, who serve you? God, this doesn't make sense. And it was at that moment that I said, God, if this is what believing in you looks like, I don't want to do it. I don't want any part of this. Now, thankfully, looking back, I'm thankful my mom was persistent in her faith. She never gave up. She never quit. My mom actually forced us to go to church. Like, drag us out of bed, throw you in the car, you're going to church today. Honestly, if it wasn't for my mom, I don't know if I would be here on this stage today. I don't understand how she had such a great faith. With everything, her whole world falling apart, she still went to church, and she still worshiped. There was one redeeming grace about church, and it was that my grandparents went too. And I hated going to church, but I loved seeing my grandma. And my grandma always had a candy bag with her at church. And so that meant if I could go and sit next to grandma, I would get extra treats for the day. And so I would go to church and sit with grandma. See, we were still having visitation times with my dad every other Saturday for a few hours. Most of the time we were going to my grandparents' house, or we would go bowling or to the movies or other fun stuff. But we never knew where he actually lived. And it was a question all of us wanted to know. Where do you live? Like, what do you do during the day? And then there was one day where he actually forgot something at his house, his wallet. So we had to go back to where he was living. And that was the moment we found out that he was living just across the street from us in another neighborhood. My dad, this entire time, was only a 5-minute walk away. And he never dared to show up. He didn't dare to call. I was hurt. I was broken. It was in 6th grade that it felt like life really started to turn around for me. I was still forced to go to church, and my mom, I was now in youth group, and there was a new leader, and my mom made me go to youth group because she finally found out my trick with my grandma. And so I was sitting in our Sunday morning youth group, and all of a sudden there was a new leader there, and he was leading the 6th grade boys group. So I made it my personal mission to make class a living nightmare for him. And his name was Gary, and I remember the first day, anything he tried to do, I tried to do the opposite of what he wanted us. He wanted us to sit down, I would stand up. He wanted us to read something, I would scream. Like, I just made it a nightmare. I was doing the exact opposite, ruining church for everybody, because I didn't want anybody to know what was going on in my life. And I wasn't a big fan of God at the time. Eventually, actually, he pulled me aside, and I remember because there was like rows of chairs kind of like this, and he grabbed one off the end, and he put it right next to him. He said, Joel, you're sitting here, and he was in the Navy, and so he got out this like really loud voice, and he's like, you're sitting here, you're not moving, I don't want to hear another word from you, you're done for the day. So I walked up like a dog with a tail between my legs, and I sat next to him. When my mom came to pick me up, Gary let her know what happened. And we were having family lunch like we usually did. My mom said, hey, why don't you come to lunch with us to Gary? And I looked at her and I was like, what? No. So Gary came to lunch. And eventually I started to realize that Gary cared about me. He was the first person to actually take me golfing, a game that I now love. And it was because Gary cared and he poured intentional time into my life. He showed up at my baseball games. He came to my basketball practices and would drive me places. It's because of him that I ended up accepting Jesus a few weeks later. And this was the moment that my relationship with Jesus truly began. See, during this time, it felt like life just started to turn around. My family, we ended up moving into a farmhouse that we absolutely loved. It was a big enough house for all of us to have our own space, and we had property that we could enjoy. It was interesting because at that time, visits with my dad seemed to get fewer and further between. And then one day he told us he was moving away, and that was it. We hadn't seen him for a long time after that. He went to New Mexico, and everything stopped. I was still very much angry and hurt with him. But I let that all slip my mind. I let all those feelings go when he left. I began to really enjoy church. I had friends and I had people there who really cared about me. And my family was amazing. They stuck by my side. Even though we moved into our house, we still didn't have beds or really dressers or anything. And this meant my siblings and I were still sleeping on air mattresses on the floor. There was a family at church who happened to hear about our situation. And they said, you know what, we want to buy you all beds. And this family I came to love. And I actually get the chance to stand in one of their weddings coming up in November. And the two boys became my best friends, and this family adopted me, and they brought me into their life. Their name is the Westra family, and Bob became like a surrogate father for me. It was then that we started to play football every Sunday. It was with Bob that I really learned what it meant to be a dad, what it meant to be a husband. And to this day, I'm still grateful for the impact Bob has had on my life. So I was now in high school, and high school seemed to go by in a flash. And my dad was still living far away. We actually had no idea if he was in New Mexico. We had heard rumors that maybe he moved somewhere to Arizona, or we had no idea where he was. And then all of a sudden the phone rang, and it was from Colorado. And he was living in Colorado, and he learned that my sister was about to graduate. And he said, I want to come to your graduation. And so he came to my sister's graduation, and that was the first time we saw him in 7 years. I remember that day because I didn't talk to him. I saw him sitting there with my grandparents, and I didn't say a word. And he was there, and then he was gone, and that was it. Then my next brother, Kyle, graduated, and he said, I want to come to your graduation. And Kyle said, absolutely not. So we didn't see him. Then my other brother, Lance, graduated, and he said, I want to come to your graduation. It was like his one time a year he had come see us. And Lance said, okay. And so I saw him, and he left. Then it was my turn. Hey, I want to come to your graduation. And it was at that moment that I was struggling. So I was like, why do you want to be there to highlight one of the biggest moments of my life so far when you had nothing to do with it, you were no part of it? Then I remembered what I had been learning in church from my friend Justin, my mentor to this day. He said, Joel, just let him come. It's the only thing that he wants to do, so just let him do it. So I said, okay, you can come. And he came to my graduation, and that was it. And we would periodically see him every now and again, maybe at a Christmas. But we really wanted nothing to do with him. And the more I kept getting involved in church, the more hatred I started to have for my dad. Because I had learned about how homosexuality and how being gay was so wrong, and I was so angry with my dad, like, don't you realize how wrong you are? And I actually remember sending him emails, because that was the only way we could communicate, with scripture references to tell him he's wrong. To say, what you're doing is messed up. And you need to change. You need to be fixed. But I started to get convicted because I realized that I was broken too. My mentor, Justin, started to meet with me one-on-one. And I'll never forget it because he looked at me and said, Joel, it's not your job to change him. You just have to forgive him. That's all you're asked to do. You need to address the hurt and the brokenness that's in your life, and you need to heal from what has happened in your past. And so that started a 3-year journey with Justin to walk through what it looks like to heal from my brokenness. We would meet every Sunday morning at a Panera Bread, and I don't like Panera Bread because of that. But it was right by our church. And Justin, still to this day, pours into my life. And then I remember I received this call to ministry. I felt like life was going really well. I was growing up. Things were happening in my life. It was going really well. And then I was like, okay, God, what is it you want me to do? And he's like, come and join ministry. And my brother was a pastor at the time. And so I said, no, I'm not going to be in ministry because ministry is stressful. Y'all are stressful. I didn't say that. So I told, yeah, amen, thank you. So I told God no the first time he called me in a ministry at a men's retreat. And then later I was volunteering with my brother, who was a youth pastor at the time. And I went to this Follow conference, which our students got to go to and experience a year ago, 2 years ago. I don't know, it felt like forever ago now. And it was at a Follow conference, the giant Wesleyan youth convention, that God called me full-time into ministry. And it was like life was perfect is what it felt like. And I was on staff at my home church at the time of Kentwood Community Church, and that's where I grew up and everybody knew me. And it was one day I was sitting in a staff chapel. It's a huge church, and so we had a staff of 30 people, and each week we had a staff chapel, and somebody would share a little devotion. And I was sitting in this staff chapel, and I'll never forget that it was Curtis Thompson, he's now Dr. Curtis Thompson, was sharing this verse, 1 John 4:18. And it says, little children, let us not love in word or speech, but let us love in action and in truth. I remember sitting, and the thoughts of loving my dad overcame me. How could I love somebody who hurt me so much? How could I love somebody who lived a lifestyle I don't agree with? Those were the questions I was asking. And I was a pastor at the time, debating if I could love somebody. Talk about conviction. I remember sitting, and I had a meeting scheduled about an hour later, and I texted the person saying, hey, I can't meet today because I need to spend time with the Lord. And I sat in the same seat in our chapel, and I sat there for the entire day asking God what he wants me to do. God, what do you mean you want me to love him? God, what does it even look like to love my dad? God, how do I love my dad who left me broken, who lives in such a way that I don't agree with? And God said, I don't know, call him. I think that's what his voice actually sounded like, was, I don't know, call him. So I called my grandmother, who I knew had my dad's cell phone number. And it ended up with me calling my dad. And that first conversation was so awkward. But I remember talking to him, saying, hey, I know this is going to sound really weird, but dude, I hated you. And I'm sorry. Those are my words. See, I realized that the same God who loves me and died for me, it's the same God that loves him and died for him. And I started to read this book called Everybody Always. And it's a really easy book to understand because it's all about loving everybody always, the same way God loves us. So from that day, this was 5 years ago now, every Wednesday my dad and I have had a phone call together. We've been working on our relationship. And it doesn't mean that we agree on everything. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect. But it's been cool to see him grow in his relationship with the Lord. I don't know if he actually has a relationship with the Lord, but I know he's starting to pray, which is cool. I know he just took a training class, and it was really funny. One of the speakers they used for the training was Craig Rochelle. And Craig Rochelle is a pastor at a church. And he goes, yeah, I really like this Craig Rochelle guy, but I don't like how much he talks about Jesus. And I remember I said, I do. that was my response. You know, I know my dad watches all of my messages, and I know he's going to watch this one too, because he knew I was talking today. There's been something so powerful in my life that I've realized, and now I even realize it more that I have a son. And it's how much God the Father truly loves us. See, I remember when I got to hold Oliver for the first time, just this overwhelming sense of love. And I realized my dad probably had that same feeling when he held me. And then I realized, man, God has that feeling for all of us each and every day, that he loves us. And was my life broken? Was there things in my past that aren't great? Sure. But God was there. God was always faithful, and God was always providing in ways that even I didn't know. To this day, I still see that God is there, and God is providing in ways that I don't even know. Just a few months ago, I had this moment where I felt scared and the enemy was attacking me. You know, Andrea and I were looking for a place to live, and it felt like, man, I'm going to end up homeless just like I was as a child. Like, we had no place to go. We couldn't find an apartment or a house to rent or anything. And the enemy started to play tricks in my mind to say, you're in ministry and still God isn't providing for you. You're going to end up in the same way you were as a kid, and you're not any better than your dad is, and you're not any better than your own situation was. But I knew something. See, now I knew Jesus. And I said, no, Jesus is bigger. Jesus is stronger, and he's going to provide for me. And he did. I mean, we moved out on the 28th, and we had to be out by the 1st of the next month. So it worked out. But God has always been good. God has always been faithful. God is still good, and God is still faithful. God works in all of the broken places. See, in our brokenness as a family, what's been so cool is that he's brought us so close together. With my brothers, I'm super close with them. I texted them both this morning. Happy Father's Day. I know they both are speaking today as I am, as they are both pastors. It's been cool to see how God has worked in my family to, even in our brokenness, the 3 boys are in ministry and leading churches. Say God can't do it, and he'll do it. God works in the broken places, and he brings forth beauty. See, I want to leave you today with this. It was really hard for me to forgive my dad. It was really hard for me to start to love him. And I believe that there's somebody like that in all of our lives. There's people that we can't stand. There's people that drive us nuts, that have hurt us in a way that we don't even maybe want to talk about. But don't we do that to God all the time? Don't we hurt him and go against what he says, but yet he still loves us and forgives us? I think today we're going to spend time in prayer. And I'm going to change it, so sorry. I think all of us have this brokenness that we don't even want to address. I think all of us have hurt that sometimes we just want to push away. It might be with our own family. It might even be with friends or even coworkers. But today I just want you to take a moment and look back over your life and see how God did work in the past. Because that's been the most beautiful part of these testimonies to me. That, yeah, maybe life wasn't always perfect, but it doesn't mean God was not faithful. So I just want you to take a moment at your seat just to enter into a time of personal prayer, where you look back over your own life and you say, God, thank you for the way that you have worked. Even in the ways maybe I didn't see it, God, thank you for the way that you have provided. Thank you that I can say it is well because of you. And then after that, we're going to sing a song. But as we enter in this time, I just want to pray with you today. So would you join me in prayer? And then you can move into that personal prayer reflection time. God, thank you for who you are. God, thank you for working even in the broken places. God, thank you for providing in ways that we don't always see. And Lord, I just pray that we take a moment right here, right now, just to say thank you to you for who you are. God, thank you for all the dads that are here in this room that have loved their children well, that have been such an amazing example to their kids, who now get to be that example to their own kids. God, thank you for those that maybe don't have children but are still a stand-in father like I had in my life. God, thank you for their willingness to step up and step in those moments. And Lord, I pray that today as we reflect on your goodness, God, that we would see just that, how you are good. Lord, even in the broken times, even when it feels like life is falling apart, help us to see that you are good. And you always are. Lord, I pray that we just reflect on you in these coming moments.